Community throughout the world, and good morning from Chicago. My name is Alexis Olson, and I'm the Vice President of the International Association of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgeons and your moderator for today's webinar, Leading Through Conflict. Next Level Forum Digital is a continuation of the Next Level Forum concept the IAOMS introduced at the IAOMS in Hong Kong in March-April this year. Through these professional development webinars, our goal is to help IAOMS members advance their careers and the OMS specialty by exploring issues and best practices related to leadership and management, both professionally and personally. To launch our Next Level Forum digital webinar series, we have webinars the next 3 months, each covering a different topic. Leading Through Conflict, which is today's topic, Having Difficult Conversations, which will be aired on June 28th, and Pitching Ideas, which is on July 26th. While today's webinar is open to members and non-members alike, Next Level Forums Digital is new benefits for the IAOMS members, and subsequent webinars will be available only to IAOMS members. We'll have information on how you can join the IAOMS at the end of today's webinar. Now let's review logistics on today's agenda. To avoid background noise and distractions, everyone is muted. However, we encourage you to ask questions at any point. Just type your questions into the box marked questions on the side of your screen. We will address as many of these questions as time permits during the presentation, and we'll have 10 minutes dedicated to questions at the end of the webinar. To make this as interactive as possible, we will be asking 3 short polling questions during the presentation. At the end of the webinar, we will send you a brief evaluation. We would like your input as we continue to develop programming to meet your needs. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Deborah Sabudil, is an IAOMS education consultant and frequent speaker and author on leadership development and management topics. An industry leader in training and facilitating adult education, Deborah produces educational content for leaders in hundreds of industries and facilitates and designs learning labs for professional and trade association clients worldwide. And now I'll turn over to Deborah, who will help us lead through conflict. Deborah?
Thank you, Dr. Olson. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the IAOMS audience around the world. Really pleased to be here with you today and to start the first of the digital content for Next Level Forum. Today's topic is around conflict. And one of the issues that is most difficult for leaders of any sort, in any nation around the world, at almost any level of the organization, is dealing with conflict. In the work that we do with many different professions and industries, both with staff and members and clinicians and executives, we find that one of the most difficult topics, and one of the topics that's requested the most, is that around how do we lead through conflict. As we know, we all have different conflict styles. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the webinar today. People deal with conflict very differently. Some of us are really comfortable in dealing with conflict, and others are very conflict averse. So in any organization, at any time, we're going to have a combination of those types of people, which makes conflict even more difficult to navigate. So I'm hoping that by the end of the program today, you'll have some tools and some resources and some ways of thinking about conflict that will help you as you move through your career, as we all move through our careers, and things that you can go back to and really think about. The next webinar in the series that Dr. Olson mentioned is going to be around how to have difficult conversations. So that really goes hand in hand with how do you lead through conflict, is, really how do you now drill down to those important conversations that you need to have when you may be in the middle of conflict. So first I'd like to just share a thought, and this is a widely heard, and you've probably heard this soundbite about leadership, and it's leader, know thyself. So we cannot be effective in any realm as leaders if we don't understand ourselves, if we don't understand our strengths, if we don't understand our own shortcomings, our blind spots, all of those things that may make conflict, or any other leadership area that we're working in difficult for us if we don't know ourselves. And just know, conflict is hard. Again, as I mentioned, this is what people struggle with the most. So if you are feeling like you're not good at dealing with conflict, or you're not good at being really a leader through conflict right now, you are certainly not alone, but it's something that can be learned. And that's the good news, is that we can all get better at it. And the more we work through conflict in a productive and really cohesive, deliberate, and very transparent way, the better we get at it. I love the next quote here, which is by Dorothy Thompson. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of creative alternatives for responding to conflict, alternatives to passive or aggressive responses, alternatives to violence. This really, I think, says it all, because what we need to strive for is not the absence of conflict. That does not exist. That is not reality. We live in a world that's full of conflict. It's, full of conflict in the workplace, but it's full of conflict outside the workplace, in the world, as we know, if we watch the news, conflict between spouses and partners, between family members, co-workers, community members, etc. So conflict is a natural part of life, and I think that's one of the things that we need to really think about as we talk about conflict, is that there's nothing wrong with conflict. Conflict can be used for the betterment of any organization or any team, but it's how we deal with the conflict that really is a sign and a measure of professional maturity. So, if you happen to be new in your career and are just starting your surgical life, you probably have a whole, litany of conflicts ahead of you in your career. So as you encounter those, the hope is that you're going to feel confident encountering those and have some thoughts around how you want to encounter those situations and how you want to deal with those situations that leaves everyone feeling good and whole and really better for the interaction. I want to start with our polls. We have 3 different polls that we'd like to have you respond to, so we know a little bit more about you and how you feel about conflict. So Kimberly, if we can go ahead and put up the first poll. You'll see that on your screen, and it's how well do you think you're able to lead through conflict currently? So select one of the following. Either you are very adept, which is 5, or all the way down to needs more work. I'll have you just note that these are anonymous, so no one knows how you're answering, and we're only going to look at the results in the aggregate. So please feel free to be as honest as you can with yourself. You're the only one that will see your individual results. And in just a moment, Kimberly will post the results of that survey. Okay, so about 40% of you are in the middle, somewhat adept, and most are then on either side, reasonably or need more practice, and only 6% of you felt you were either very adept or needed significantly more work. So I think many of you are in the middle, which is great, and you probably feel like you have some tools and resources for how to deal with conflict, but maybe that you're looking to, finesse it a bit more. So next poll. Okay. What type of conflict is most difficult for you? Please answer that. And Kimberly, whenever you're ready and you have results, please go ahead and show us the results of the poll. Can we show results? What type of conflict is most difficult for you? Personality-based conflict, 45%, with the next highest being value-based. Great. Okay, and our final poll. With whom do you feel most challenged in a conflict? Other surgeons, clinical staff, hospital healthcare administrators, or patients families? And if we can go ahead and show results. Okay, well, this is fairly evenly spread, with other surgeons being the highest result at 30%, and hospital and healthcare administrators being next, and then other clinical staff. Great, thank you, Kimberly, for the polling. We're now going to move on to the definition of conflict, and I'm not going to get into all of these and read you the list, but what I'd like to say is that the definition of conflict is really around a tension that exists when there are competing goals. And as we think about organizational life, whether it's a hospital or any other organization, there are always competing goals and competing demands, because we have budgets and we have patient issues and we have protocol and a whole host of things that can at any given time and on any given day cause problems. But what we need to know is that conflict is natural and inevitable, and it can be a motivator for change. If we did not have conflict, we may never change. We may get too comfortable in our routine. We may get too comfortable in the way we deal with people in our practices. And many organizations, there's so much written in leadership and management literature about organizations that do not have conflict, where they have leadership at the top that all think exactly the same way, and that it many times leads them down a path of failure because they don't have people raising their hand or pointing things out that are not right with the system or that can be done better. I also think as we talk about diversity and inclusion, and we talk about wanting to have a diverse workforce and wanting to be inclusive of people from all cultures, walks of life, et cetera, we have to understand that with that will come differing opinions. So, we don't just want diversity and inclusion for the sake of diversity and inclusion and then want everyone to think the same. Part of the beauty of diversity and inclusion is that we are able to gather and incorporate a lot of different perspectives. So with that comes a lot of different thoughts, a lot of different opinions, and a lot of different backgrounds that lead people to the decisions and the things that they say and the beliefs that they have. So I think we have to expect that as our workforce becomes more diverse, that we may have more conflict, but again, conflict is not a bad thing. It just means that things are going to rise to the top as we start to not all look and think the same way that maybe didn't previously. And again, conflict can be either constructive or destructive, and that is really on the leader. So in any given situation that you're presented with, you have an opportunity to go down one path, which is really a very constructive way of dealing with whatever that conflict is, or you have the opportunity to go down the other path, which is a more destructive path that obviously is going to probably have ramifications beyond even what you can imagine at the time. Really, again, conflict can contribute to organizational health. So if nothing else, I hope you leave this webinar today thinking conflict is not a bad thing. Conflict is natural, it's healthy for an organization, it's how we as leaders deal with conflict that is really what we need to think about. So here are four, there's many different types of conflict, but here are four different areas that we typically would have conflicts over. Projects, resources, deadlines, and interpersonal conflicts. And many of you just answered a poll about this a few minutes ago. And I'd like to actually turn this over to Dr. Olson for just a minute and ask, Dr. Olson, can you speak to, as an oral and maxillofacial surgeon, what types of conflicts do you see most prevalent in your work? And you know, how do you deal with those conflicts?
Well, I think one of the things is to consider is the situation that you are professionally, whether it is in an office privately or if it's in conjunction with the hospital and so forth. And I think what happens is those kind of lines blur over easily. I think most of the ones that you see is over the interpersonal conflicts that you deal with from a hospital standpoint, which may have to do with other surgeons or services, as well as administrators, and interpersonal conflicts that can arise simply by the day-to-day activities that you deal with in an office.
Absolutely. And probably many of you feel that way as well. I think you said that your biggest level of conflict was with your surgical team and the next was with the administrators. So that seems to be in line with what others on the line are saying as well. Thank you, Dr. Olson. As we're dealing with conflict, I would say, you know, other than leader know thyself, what I would add to that is leader know thy audience. So when we're talking about an audience, we're not necessarily talking about an audience sitting in a theater waiting to hear you present a paper. We're talking about any audience that you may have. We're talking about, it could be a patient that's your audience. It could be your staff. It could be other surgeons. It could be administration in a hospital. It could be academicians. There's a whole long list of audiences that you may be dealing with. And so that's really the first step is, first of all, knowing yourself, knowing your own tendencies, your blind spots, meaning, you know, what you don't see about yourself, and also who is it that you're having the conflict with. The more you understand that person, understand their perspective, have empathy, and sort of put yourself in that person's shoes, you know, taking a moment before the situation gets heated, but sort of, you know, stepping back for a minute and thinking about who is this person, what do they come to the table with, you know, did I hit something that was particularly sensitive to them? Are they having a bad day? Am I having a bad day? You know, what do they know about the situation, or what do they not know about the situation that I may need to educate them on? And then considering primary and secondary audiences. So one example of that may be the primary audience may be your patient. The secondary audience may be that patient's family or that patient's, you know, spouse or partner. So something else to think about. And then, you know, are you actually involved in the conflict yourself, or are you a bystander to the conflict? And is it something that you feel you need to be involved in, even as a bystander, because you need to mitigate the conflict? So I think that's something to think about as well. When we talk about areas of disagreements and where conflicts fall, we've got, you know, facts. So, you know, do we disagree about what the facts of the situation are and how the conflict is presenting itself, or the situation over which we're having a conflict is presenting itself? Are we in disagreement over our methods? You know, maybe it's a surgical method or procedure, or perhaps it's the way we're dealing with, you know, an administrator, or one of those things. Is it goals, that we don't have the same goals? When we don't have the same goals, that becomes very difficult because we're not marching in the same direction as colleagues, you know, and we're talking again about the workplace. So it's really important that when we're in the workplace, we have some common element of goals. And then values. So values are issues that are important to us. It may be issues around family, it may be issues around faith, it may be issues around honesty, transparency, those types of things. So as you can see on the scale below, it gets more and more difficult to resolve conflict as we move toward conflict around values. So facts, for the most part, are pretty black and white. They're pretty cut and dry. It's either this or it's this. And if we can resolve and get on the same page, either through the use of data or, you know, however we do that, looking further into the issue, that's fairly easy to resolve. Once we get into personal values that are in disagreement, that becomes much more difficult. And again, as we start to have a more diverse workplace, wherever you're at in the world, we may see more challenges over values. So we have to, again, acknowledge that. We have to be prepared for that. We have to respect that. And we have to think about how do we navigate those areas that are not as black and white as just, you know, what are the facts or what are the procedures that we're going to follow, those kinds of things. So other complicating factors, and there are always complicating factors, aren't there? So varying wants, needs, or goals. Perception. There's a saying that says perception is reality. So many times what we find when we're in conflict with someone is that we perceive the situation very differently. So it's not a matter of necessarily that we disagree on the fundamentals, but it's that we are seeing things from two different vantage points and we're reading different things into the situation. So sometimes we have to think about, you know, as we're dealing with another person in conflict, as I mentioned, know that audience. What is their perception of the situation coming in? Is their perception that you have an agenda and you're trying to push through your own agenda? Is their perception that you're not being honest? Is their perception that you're trying to hide something for them? Once we uncover what that other person's perceptions are, many times we can then find agreement because we can clear that up. We can clear the air on that perception. Then we have, you know, gender, cultural differences, age, and I do a lot of speaking on the generations, and as we probably all know, the generations are very different in how they deal with just about everything. So we have, you know, in the workforce, we have people that are part of the traditionalist generation that are 70 plus, and then we have folks that are part of the millennial generation that are 35 to about 22, and then we have those that are now Gen Z, which are coming up, high school, college, etc. They were raised in very different times, and the way we deal with things based on our age and our generation can be very different, and that can really create a lot of tension in the workplace. And then personality and behavioral styles, and Dr. Olson spoke to that just a minute ago, work styles, language differences. So these are all things that we, when we add it to the mix, makes dealing with conflict a little bit more complicated. We're going to talk a little bit for the next few minutes about this Thomas Tillman conflict mode instrument. And a number of, if you see a website on the screen, www.cpp.com, that is a website that has a number of different really strong leadership and management assessments that you can take, just if you are interested in doing so, to learn a little bit more about your own leadership style. And this conflict mode assessment instrument is a popular one, at least in North America, and really is fairly predictive of how, what your style is like when you are in situations of conflict. And then it also kind of helps you. It's really interesting to do as a team, because if you do it as a team, you really start to understand, just like any assessment you do as a team, you start to understand where the players are and why maybe they act the way they do and how they react the way they do, and how you might do a better job of approaching that person or dealing with the conflict in the future based on your style and theirs. But even if you just do it for yourself, I think it's very instructive in terms of understanding ourselves, going back to leader know thyself. But there are 5 different ways, different sort of buckets that we might put a person in this assessment. And at the very top, if you sort of look at the X and Y axes, you've got, at the very top on the left, you've got the assertiveness or, the very least assertive scale. And then along the bottom, you've got the cooperative versus, uncooperative. So many times when people are looking at this, they can easily peg themselves. Usually when I'm doing a program, there's a whole, if I were to ask people to raise their hand and say, where do you think you are? We'd have a really large portion of people in the avoiding segment here. So a lot of people know that they are not good at dealing with conflict. They try to avoid it. Others will readily raise their hand on competing and will say, no, I like to win. I am a competitor at heart, and that is really how I like to work in the workplace. Others will talk about accommodating and that they feel like they really just want to make other people happy. They want to keep the peace. They want a harmonious workplace, etc. But as we look at the definitions, when we talk about competing, you're satisfying your own concerns at the other individual's expense. So when we're in competition mode, we're going for the goals. We're trying to win. Doesn't mean it's bad to occasionally be in a competing mode. Sometimes you need to be. Sometimes when you are doing something that is, you may need to compete for dollars or for a share of the budget that you truly believe is needed for equipment or for something that will better the care of your patients. So we have to put all these into context. Sometimes we're competing in a way that may mean there's a loser in the competition, if you will, but you're doing it for the betterment of a cause or your patients or the hospital or, another valid reason. Then we've got, I'm going to skip collaborating for a minute, then we've got compromising. And many times individuals think compromising is the best, right? We've heard that sort of, for decades and decades that we need to compromise. The problem with compromising is we both are usually only satisfying part of what we want. So we have 2 people, both parties are giving something up and both parties are getting something. So it's fine. It's better than a win-lose in most situations, but it doesn't necessarily satisfy both parties. And so both people may walk away feeling that they didn't really have a successful conversation or a successful solution to whatever that conflict is. Avoiding is just sidestepping, really not thinking about satisfying anyone's concerns or resolving the situation, but sort of walking away. There are times when that is completely legitimate to do. And I'm sure you can think of times in your work life and in your personal life where sometimes you have to pick your battles. There's a saying, pick your battles. You can't fight over everything. You can't have conflict over everything. Sometimes you just need to walk away. And then accommodating. So in accommodating, you attempt to satisfy the other person's concern at the expense of your own. What ends up happening with those that are really, their go-to style is accommodating, is it can lead to resentment. So the more that I feel I'm always the one giving something up, the more I feel resentful that I am always giving something up. So it can be a dangerous minefield, if you will, to always be in accommodating mode, or to have, to work with someone that's always trying to accommodate you, because eventually they may blow, and eventually they may say, I've had enough. So even if you see someone that's always trying to accommodate, it can be a really good practice to turn the tables on them and say, well, what would you like? What is your recommendation? What do you think is right in this situation? Collaborating is probably the best, because that is finding a win-win solution that satisfies both parties. Many times what that looks like is, people come to the table in a conflict with their own agenda. I have my agenda, you have your agenda, and we, in a compromising situation, we're sort of picking apart both of those, and we're trying to find something acceptable. In a collaborating style, what we're doing is we may start with just a blank sheet, and we may say, let's put both of our agendas away, and let's sit down with a fresh perspective on this, and let's come up with something that works for both of us. So let's really talk about, if we were to do this in a whole new way, in a perfect world, what would we do? What would we do together that would really make us both happy and resolve this conflict most effectively? So again, if you have any interest in this assessment, I think it's really interesting. I would also say that you will have a tendency toward one of these 5, but it doesn't mean you are always in one of these modes. You may be someone that is more accommodating in the workplace than you are at home. You may be more of an avoider on the home front, or you may be more of a collaborator at home and an accommodator at work, or vice versa. So these are not universal, and you also may be, even in the workplace, in different situations in the workplace, you may vacillate between some of these different styles, again, depending on the situation. So you're reading your audience, as we talked about earlier. Knowing that audience, you are really thinking about, what should my style be? I know what my go-to style is, but what should my style be as I'm approaching this person based on what I know about them and their perception and their background and how they're going to read the situation. So then there's, constructive conflict. Let's talk about that. And one way to really look at conflict in a constructive manner is to sort of say, as you're going into it, what is my intention? So really stopping and doing a check on yourself before a conflict, before getting into a situation of conflict, before saying something, before doing something. Really sort of saying, is my intention good here? Am I too angry to have this conversation? Am I too angry to approach this conflict right now? Do I want to be helpful? Where are we at in the conflict? Sometimes it's much easier to resolve a conflict that is a first conflict you're having with an individual, rather than this is the 10th time we're in a conflict over this very same issue, and now you're feeling really fed up, really done, and you're probably not in a good state of mind about it, and maybe rightfully so. But where you're at in the conflict, and has the conflict been going on for 2 months? Is it new? Is it, all of those things. And again, as we talked about earlier, we don't necessarily want to ignore conflict because, it tends to be like a cancer, and it grows and it festers and it gets worse and worse. So if you find that you are saying to yourself, well, this conflict's been going on for 6 months, then perhaps you shouldn't have let the conflict go on for 6 months. So it will get worse over time if not dealt with. And I think that's pretty universal with most conflicts, unless it's something you should walk away from, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And do you want to maintain a relationship with that person? So, sometimes we have conflicts with people or in situations where it doesn't matter if it doesn't go perfectly, because it's an interaction with someone that perhaps, you will never come into contact with again. So, maybe you have a conflict with a store owner over a purchase you made. And, is it worth your time and energy to really do a lot of soul searching about that conflict and how to resolve it, versus someone in the workplace that you, are with every day, or, someone that is in your personal life that you're with every day. Those you have a much more vested interest in spending time and energy to resolve. And what are some of the consequences of each approach? So timing, sometimes when we're getting into situations of conflict, the conflict happens because of timing. It happens because things are perhaps rushed. It happens because it's a a day, a really bad day for another person, or a really bad day for yourself, or you just got some bad news and now you're walking into the workplace, or you almost got in a car accident on your way driving into the hospital, or something along those lines. So thinking about, as you're approaching situations of conflict, is the time right? And sometimes I think it's all about a matter of allowing some time, time to cool down, time to think, time to strategize about how am I going to deal with this situation, rather than in the moment with a not so cool head dealing with the conflict and then regretting what you've said or done after the fact that may take a long time to repair. So again, timing can play an issue, can play into all of this. If you know that you have to have a discussion around a conflict, or you need to approach someone with something that you're having a conflict about, thinking about the timing and is it the right time, or might this be better tomorrow when that person isn't as stressed as they are, or might it be better after work, or might it be better in a private office rather than in the hospital, et cetera. So I wait for the time to be right to do that. All of those things need to be taken into consideration. And then factors that cause conflict. There are so many. I'm not going to read down the entire list, but one that I do want to talk about is this cultural issue. And in some organizations, there is a cultural issue of, sort of pitting people against each other and seeing who comes out, winning in those situations. So we all will encounter, cultures that are not healthy in organizations. But that doesn't mean that we ourselves need to subscribe to that kind of a culture. We can still separate ourselves from the pack, and we can still own that interaction and handle that interaction in a way that's really healthy. And always we want to think about leaving that other person feeling whole. Whatever the interaction is, we don't want to make someone feel small. We don't want to start with personal attacks. And even bullying, and there's a lot of talk about bullying with kids and with teens, but there's bullying that happens on the job all the time. And it may not come in a form that you would recognize it as, schoolyard bullying, but it does happen. And, is there a situation going on where someone is sort of being bullied or pressured into a situation that they're not comfortable with? There's also the polarization, and I don't know how many of you have ever experienced this or found yourself doing this, but when you start to feel negatively towards someone, instead of dealing with it, you start to sort of freeze them out. So instead of, talking to them about it, it's a slow frost that comes over, where you just stop making small talk with them when you see them, when you pass them in a hallway. You stop saying good morning to them when they come in. You stop asking them about, their family or their life. Those kinds of things happen often because we're not dealing with the conflict. So we slowly pull away from someone to the point that they feel polarized and they feel like they're on the outside of a situation, or on the outside of, the social network of the organization, which can be really demoralizing and really difficult for a person to deal with. And then we have constructive conflict, and this is, again, where I'd like Dr. Olson to give us his perspective, but there are many really positive ways to deal with constructive conflict, and it's really focused on the issues, not the personality, not the person. A commitment to group goals. You will see, across the world, even as we look at really, really difficult situations happening in the world, what you'll hear sometimes world leaders say is, we can agree that we all love our children. We can agree that we want our children to grow up in a safe world. So find what it is that you can agree on. And it may be, as you're in a really tough situation, it may be saying, I know we both want what's best for the organization, or I know we both want what's best for this patient's safety and this patient's recovery. So where can you find commonality? Wherever you can find commonality, start there and work from that point forward. Dr. Olson, do you want to weigh in on this and give us a sense of how you may see some of these or have used some of these constructive mechanisms?
Definitely.
Well, I think one of the things, as I mentioned before, the issue, for example, of conflict between other specialties or hospital situations is at least for me, at the end of the day, it always comes down to the care of the patient. And ultimately that should be, and it should be for everybody parties involved, is the goal, is the patient's outcome. And that's oftentimes what I utilize in terms of trying to approach this. And that's usually where, when you look at differences in surgical approaches, how to manage patients and who should manage patients, is ultimately trying and to get the best and most favorable outcome for that. However, what I do find is that sometimes that is utilized oftentimes as the common goal, but that is not the actual goal of the individual party. In other words, they use that empathy or the common goals that is suggested, but in reality, it's their own agenda, only driven on a different level. So it's a hard thing to deal with, I think. And I think when you look at the list of the factors that look at constructive conflict resolution, it starts, I think, at the end of the day, is if you want to use the competition cooperation, it really becomes cooperation and how you will resolve things in a cooperative manner. But I think it would automatically assume that if you were cooperating, at the end of the day, the outcome for the patient and the best interest of the patient would be an automatic solution, but it isn't necessarily the case. But I would say that's always the end goal that I look for in terms of these conflicts.
Fabulous. Thank you, Dr. Olson. And I think what you're saying is what most people find, in that there are many layers to conflicts. It's not easy to resolve, even if everyone says we all believe in the care of the patient. People have different approaches, and they may have their own their own agendas at the end of the day, and that's what we have to try to tease out and figure out. Kimberly, was there a question?
There was. One of our attendees asked, how do I de-escalate a conflict, which I know you spoke a bit to, but maybe you could elaborate.
Sure. I think that one of the ways of de-escalating a conflict is certainly dealing with the conflict, and it may be that you are approaching that person and saying, I feel that there's something that's not right between us right now, or I feel like, there's something that is building that is less than positive, and I really want to talk to you about it so that we can come to some solution about it. So I think having a sort of a one-on-one private conversation with someone, there are all kinds of ways to do it. I am a big fan of finding a neutral spot, particularly if it's a colleague, if it's a peer, not asking someone to come to your office, because there's, sort of the power zones and all of that people can read into that, but saying, something, I feel like we're having a conflict here. I don't want it to get any worse. I don't want it to escalate. So why don't we go grab a cup of coffee together after work and talk this through, and go somewhere where you can really have a conversation that is confidential and collegial and all of that. And I think also if you feel it escalating, you probably sense that it's only going to get worse. So my advice would be just to nip it quickly, and then if it may not resolve it, but one of the things we'll talk about in the next program on the discussions to have is, at the end of it, sort of saying, okay, we haven't really come to an agreement. You can either decide to agree to disagree. You can say, this is where we're at right now. You have agreed that you'll do this. I've agreed that I'll do this. Can we have coffee in a month and see where we're at? Can we have coffee in a week and see where we're at? but not necessarily look at it as a one and done, because sometimes you cannot resolve a conflict just with one conversation. Sometimes it takes a little more work, but showing, I think, a commitment to wanting to resolve the conflict goes a long way with most people. As we move on, level of involvement, and this is where I mentioned before, you don't necessarily always want to be in avoiding mode, because that's not really a healthy mode to be in most of the time, but sometimes you do. So when you look at a conflict, you say, is this a conflict that I need to be involved in? So even if it's someone coming at you with something, you can choose to disregard and remove yourself, just walk away. You can not give it another thought. And there are people that can absolutely do that. Some of us will ruminate on it more, we'll think about it more. But hopefully we can get to a point of accepting it and removing ourselves. There is also the accept the person and understand. And again, this is where empathy comes in. So it's not that you're agreeing, but I understand where you're at. I empathize with your perspective, your position. I understand, but we're not necessarily going to agree. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to say to someone, we agree to disagree. If it's something that you don't absolutely need resolution on. If you absolutely need resolution on something, and it's patient care or something as critical as that, obviously you can't do that. You need to resolve that issue. You can also try to influence the person and their behavior, but as we know, that only goes so far. It's up to that other individual to make the decision if they're going to come to the table, meet you halfway, collaborate with you on a new solution, etc. But you can certainly put yourself in a situation where you're trying to influence the person. One of the easiest ways to be able to influence someone is if you supervise that person. So that's a much more, readily available and easy way to influence someone than it is a peer, where you have to really think about, all right, how do I make a case for, and we're going to talk about this in the third webinar program, but how do I make a case to really influence and persuade this person to see it my way? And then, how you want to determine what you do here is based on the importance of that person in your life, the frequency of the behavior, and the level that that behavior affects you. If it is something that really is between two other people and it doesn't affect you and it's not causing a dangerous situation or a harmful situation, it may be something that you don't want to be involved in. If there is something that happens once in a great while and it's something that you can live with and it's minor, so the frequency is not extreme, that may be something that you want to walk away from as well. If the person is not important to you, again, if it's a store owner or if it's someone on an 800 number on a customer service line, again, those kinds of conflicts don't matter as much as those, with someone who really is important in your life, either a colleague at work or a family member, etc. I sometimes use the analogy of, if you have, that cranky uncle that comes to a holiday meal and you don't see eye to eye on anything, is it worth it to be arguing through that holiday meal, or you just accept that person and say it's once a year and then, turn around and walk away? So parlay that into the workplace and think about how often are you interfacing with that person? How important is it that you really have to resolve that? And then we're going to talk about this on the next webinar. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a preview of what we're going to talk about on the next webinar, and that is the model for effective conflict discussion. So it's setting the tone, and again, I mentioned earlier, where are you having that conversation? What does that sound like? What does the invitation sound like? People talk about getting emails that say, I need to see you at 4 p.m. Well, I need to see you at 4 p.m. to many people means I'm getting a pink slip at 4 p.m. or I'm getting fired at 4 p.m. or I'm in trouble and I'm going to have a difficult conversation versus I've noticed that, we're not on the same page about X, Y, or Z. Can we have coffee at 4 p.m. and just talk about this a little bit? Comes across very differently. So again, setting the tone is really important. Stating the issue once you actually are in the meeting. Listening and acknowledging. There's an old saying that we have one mouth and two ears for a reason, and that is that we should listen twice as much as we should speak. So we need to listen. We need to be tuned into what's going on with that other person. And then we share our perspective. I think, again, we'll talk about this more during the next call, but sometimes it's more effective to let the other person speak first, particularly in a situation of conflict, giving them the floor first and then sharing your perspective, rather than they sit down and you hit them with a barrage of complaints or feelings that you have. Let them go first. Identify solutions. So how do we resolve this? And then reach an agreement. And the agreement may be, again, we agree to disagree. The agreement may be we agree to revisit this in a week, or the agreement can be something completely different. As we end the webinar today, and we're going to open up for questions in just a minute, in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity by Albert Einstein. And again, I hope that you'll think about conflict as an opportunity rather than something to be avoided. It really provides a right place and time to have conversations that maybe have been long needed and that will better your practice, the hospital, patient care, etc. So with that, I'll go ahead and open up for questions, either for me or for Dr. Olson.
So Deborah, we do have a question. The first question is, you said it's easiest to resolve differences over facts, but what if each person has a different view of what the facts are? Where do you start?
Well, and I think that happens more and more in today's world, that we do come with different sets of facts or different perceptions on what the facts are. Sometimes I'm a big believer in letting data speak for itself. So I think as much as you can come to a situation where we are in disagreement about what the facts are, as much as you can come with evidence of those facts, I think that's important. I think that, again, really having a meeting of the minds and talking through what those facts may be and going through them sort of one by one and either agreeing or disagreeing on them. And then I think if you're really at a stalemate, sometimes you do need a third party involved in that discussion or a larger group. So sometimes people, even in the workplace, will have someone sort of mediate that conversation or weigh in, or it can be brought to a larger group. So if you say, we are disagreeing on what the essential facts are of this situation, why don't we bring it to our larger clinical group, or why don't we bring it to the XYZ committee and let them weigh in on it? As long as you both agree that that's a valid way to approach it, you can get others' perspectives, and you'll either find that they will, they'll end up supporting your position, or maybe it will open your eyes to something that you didn't actually realize or see, or a different perspective that you had than maybe the larger group has. So I think trying to work it out with evidence as much as possible, and then involving others if you're really at a stalemate, is probably the best way to handle that. Any other questions?
What do you do if the person you're having a conflict with hasn't attended this seminar and doesn't envision the different ways of, they're not open to envisioning the different ways of how to manage the conflict? So maybe they only see from their perspective one way, which would be which would not be collaboration. How do you educate them about different ways the two of you might approach the conflict?
A really good question. I think, again, it starts with conversation, and it may be, you know, sitting down with that person and saying, you know, these are the various ways we can, in my, you know, opinion, these are the various ways that we can resolve the conflict, and not necessarily doing an educational session with them, but going through, you know, we can do this, we can do X, we can do Y, we can do Z. What do you think, and what is your perspective on the way that we should, you know, go about resolving this? So again, I would softly educate and put in front of them what you see as some of the options, but then really listen to them. And sometimes you have to do some of that reflective listening. What I think I'm hearing you say is, so can we agree on, I think what you mean is this, am I hearing you correctly, those kinds of things. And again, sort of layering in some of the soft education on, well, you know, we can either take this path or this path or this path. Do you have another path that you'd like to put on the table? Do you have another option that you'd like to put on the table? But at least you can start using these different ways to resolve conflict, and sort of softly educate that other person on the fact that there are different ways to resolve disagreement. Anything else, Kimberly?
That is it on the questions at this time.
Could I add just one quick observation also that
Absolutely.
I think is important to realize here, is we live in a society right now where questions are answered or need to be answered, perceived by everybody, have to be answered and the solution produced within 2 seconds of the question. And when you deal with conflict resolution, the reality is conflict resolution doesn't happen with a conflict that appears and the resolution and the solution to it within 30 seconds. Oftentimes what you've been talking about, Deborah, is what I perceive is that it takes negotiation, and that's at the end, a give and take at some point, and that takes a defined amount of time, and every single conflict has a different amount of time that it may take to resolve itself. In addition to that, the utilization of outside parties, I think, is a critical component of it, because we all become so monolithic in our view oftentimes that we fail to see the forest for the trees. It's because at the end of the day, perhaps your own point of view was less factual based than you thought it was, and at the end of the point, with other people who don't have the same agendas, who don't have the same priorities, who don't have the same point of view, actually have the easier solution, and therefore may move things in a more concerted and straightforward, simple fashion. But I think we are oftentimes very easily pressured into having to have a solution immediately upon the question that is raised in an environment. And I think that's just the defining moment of how we are right now in a society. You talked about, I need to meet with somebody at 4 o'clock, and it's now 3:30, which involves a complete interruption of everything else that one is doing, which incites conflict in itself as well. So just a couple of observations.
Great observations. Thank you so much. Great. Well, thank you. I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Dr. Olson now.
Okay. Well, thank you all for participating in this first Next Level Forum digital webinar. And thank you, Deborah Daffodil, for all your work here today. We are pleased to offer this benefit to the IAOMS members and non-members, but subsequent webinars, as I mentioned previously, will be open to the IAOMS members only. If you would like to learn more about the IAOMS membership benefits, such as the IJOMS International Journal of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgery, access to worldwide network of OMFS specialists, reduced rates for the ICOMS meetings, and more, please contact Katie Cairns, our membership manager at the IAOMS headquarters. Also, please complete the program evaluation that you will receive shortly. It's very important for your feedback and allows us to develop this series of webinars as we move along. We hope you will join us in June for the webinar called Having Difficult Conversations, and in the meantime, we look forward to receiving your evaluation and your input. Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody.